Hey, Jer.
Hey, Michael. That was a fantastic sermon on the church and the Holy Spirit, and so challenging for us. And I loved how you didn't shy away from things I think we needed to hear as a church. And so I don't want to waste time because I have so many questions for you, and we only have a limited amount of time to do this.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you right out of the gate. You had this comparison in your sermon of Israel to the church now, and you said, what God did with Israel in the Old Testament was, let's create a society that other nations want to be a part of, that they look at and they go, I want that for me. So let's fast forward to right now in Canada, the church. How do you see that play out? Like, how should the church now look? How should we be in a country like Canada so that the rest of the country looks at the church in Canada and goes, I want that. I want to be a part of something like that.
Yeah, like simple logic would basically just say we can't be like the culture because they can't aspire to be something that they already are. So if the church is in a Venn diagram, 95% culture and then 5% different, well, that just is not enticing whatsoever. So there has to be a distinctness about it. Now, the description with Israel is the fact that they were supposed to just embody the Ten Commandments, and that was supposed to be this beacon of light for everybody to feel comfortable and safe, to be drawn to, the covenant God to Israel. And so, in some ways, depending on your hermeneutics or whatever, like the Ten Commandments still are just really, really vital to you as a follower of Jesus or as a Christian. But to make it kind of easier, we could also just say, the baseline thing for us to follow Jesus is to love God and to love neighbor. Now, that's pretty broad strokes, big umbrella. But then Jesus goes even further, describing what that even looks like, Matthew 5-7 in the Sermon on the Mount. How do you handle anger? How do you handle lust? How do you handle making a commitment or forgiveness? The primacy of prayer in a follower of Jesus. And so in the same way that the Ten Commandments marked Israel, maybe the Sermon on the Mount needs to mark us, and we actually live in those kinds of ways. And then everybody else just goes, what's that about? Like that's.
Do you think sometimes we overthink it and it's like, hey, let's start with just being like really good people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's be the best people around when it comes to how we treat other people, how we are in relationships, fighting for justice where there's injustice, all these different things. Like, what do you think? Do we just overthink it sometimes?
Yeah, to be honest, like one of the best litmus tests, I think, is do I live a life that makes other people ask questions? Why are you so generous? Why did you go out of your way to go do that? I don't understand. How did you forgive that person so easily? Like, that's how I try to live my life in a way that goes like, it's not that hard. I think I have this working theory in my mind. Whenever the gospel is present, people will ask questions. And so if people stop asking questions about me and it just seems so obvious, then it probably means that I'm not being right on track. And so sometimes I do think we overthink it and we try to build these grand theories or structures or systems or frameworks of like ways to do things in like a Christian way or whatever. But it's just like, follow him authentically in the way that he's called you to follow him, and he'll do the rest of the work. Right. So it is a pretty simple framework.
And I think connected to this, I loved how you brought out the point of, the church's position here in this conversation is not just a place that pushes its morality on everyone from some superiority, place above. You have to be moral like we think you should be.
Right.
I think that's really profound. I think we need to hear that, but also maybe unpack that a bit for us. How do we as the church, or maybe you personally, how do you escape that kind of Christian superiority complex of feeling like we're better than other people or something on a moral level? Like, how do you actually deal with that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually driving in today and I was, doing my classic audio Bible cheat. Everyone thinks you have to read it, and I just had to read for me. It's the treadmill of devotionals. And actually the passage that was today was all the disciples are fighting with each other about who's greater. And then it says, Jesus knew their motivations, and so he presented them a child. Then he says, this is what you have to be like in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. And for me, that's just like this powerfully profound area of going like, in every instance where Jesus could have taken the superior claim, he never did that. The temptations where Satan goes to him and he says, I will give you all of the kingdoms. And it's like, obviously there's a billion questions there. Is that even Satan's to give? And Jesus is already superior. He's like, no, I'm good. I don't need to jump off of this temple and show everybody how powerful I am, or to do this great work with bread or anything like that. Like, we don't have to do those things. And so for me, it's just a constant re-understanding of who Jesus is, reminding myself of the gospel, remind myself in order to be the greatest, I actually have to be the least. I have to become most servanted. So those are kind of the things that remind me of, like, this is how I need to be able to do this, and just be reminded by Jesus' words.
Yeah, I think that's great. And humility plays such a huge role as Christians in, I think, everything, right? That has to be our starting point, because that's Christ's, ethos. That's his starting point, is humility in everything. You also made this great point where you talked about, how we even view church or our experience of church. And you said something along the lines of, we're making a judgment about a thing that we're not even participating in properly. And so it's kind of a false judgment. I think the line was, you can't just go to church once a month and think then you're doing this,
right.
but you're making a judgment about your experience based on that. Talk about that a little bit. What is the actual ideal, without getting legalistic?
Right.
What's the ideal? What is it we're called to as Christians in terms of the church community and what that actually should look like before we go judging our experience on, lesser things, something like that?
Yeah, I think actually social media is probably a really great analogy to this. Like the classic, kind of cliche saying is that social media is just showing everybody else's highlights, and don't compare that to your everyday. Everyone's great cinematic reel or something like that. We treat the church kind of in that same facet, where we attend on Sunday and we're on our best, foot forward or whatever. And we have, the best things that we could wear, and we're smiling, and our language seems pretty different. And all of a sudden everyone's a father and a brother and whatever. And we just try to be all holy and such and everything like that. And it's are we just presenting a highlight reel of ourselves whenever we attend a service on a Sunday? And I think what we need to do is actually get past that and go, how do we not self-curate some kind of appearance for people and have the proximity of the church so close to us that they actually call us on our stuff when we don't even know that they can see those things, right? So for me, it's been so important to be involved in a community group. That's my number one thing. So as a pastor, I want to be able to set the example. I have people at my house. And to be honest, I am a disaster in a lot of different ways. My dirty clothes is in the bathroom, and people are going to my house and I forget. And it's that is going to be a filter to which they see me as a pastor. Is this guy's kind of gross. And I can't curate that. They've seen the way that I've interior designed my house, or the way that I use technology, or the RGB lights on my computer. And they're this guy's kind of a nerd. I actually don't get to curate those things as much because they're so close, and they see things that maybe I haven't been able to control. So it should be the goal for us, is asking ourselves the question, have I curated my appearance in front of the church? Or have I let them into a level where they're actually able to call me out on things that I'm not even aware of for myself? And if we can't get there, then I think sometimes there's all of these beefs on social media or whatever about the church. And for me, it's you haven't even engaged in the church. Now, obviously some things when it comes to, abuse or things of that nature, it doesn't really matter. But in other areas where, people will say, the church tried to hold me accountable on something. And so I just went to the next church because I never really felt like somebody could actually, really keep me accountable in that way. And I've noticed that in a couple different manners. I saw someone at a coffee shop, and they were with a group of people that didn't go to our church. And when they introduced me, they said, this is the pastor of the church that I go to. And I was that's really interesting. Just that language. This is the pastor of the church that I go to. Whereas before, I would have always said, oh, that's my pastor. And I think the difference is this kind of ownership. It's no, that's my person. And I think that has actually gone away a little bit in our engagement with church, where it's no, I'm actually taking on what that person says as my own, and that person as my own, versus just this arm's distance length that I think we're kind of afraid with when we engage with the church.
Yeah, there's definitely a certain shift, I think, in vulnerability that we've seen of how people engage. And all that has to do probably with technology and the way that we can choose to engage in everything in the world in the way we want. And so we're kind of starting to view church that way more and more, I think. And it's well, I can choose how much I want to be involved, or choose how much I want to be vulnerable, or how much I give of myself. But I think to your earlier point of being this model of a society or a community or a group that other people want for themselves, if we're all being what you talked about humble serving other people, sacrificing, then really to truly be a part of this thing is that you're actually amongst other people doing that around you as you're doing that. And then you're living in this place where actually your whole life is different because, when you go through something tough, you have other people who are wanting to sacrifice for you. When someone else is going through something, you want to sacrifice for them. And it's this beautiful thing if the church is functioning properly. But if you're not engaged in it, then you're not participating in that. And then you're not getting the benefit of that different kind of life. And I think you drew that out really well and really pushed us on. And I think that's a great challenge for all of us, as how are we engaging? Certainly, after COVID and people changing their habits, how are we engaging? Are we actually engaging in this thing or not? And so thanks for doing that. Thanks for calling us out on some stuff in that sermon. It was really, really important, I think, and challenging us. Now, I said this was our last one in the Essentials series. What's next is we're going to do a couple of weeks in a series we like to call Misquoted, where we look at different passages of the Bible that have actually been taken out of context, famously, and we try and put them in their proper context so that we understand what they're actually talking about. It's a really cool little series where we're going to look at some interesting texts out of the Bible and explore them further. And of course, if you love the ministry that we do here at Village Church, all of this is possible because of your generosity and your support. So please continue to give to this ministry so that we can do stuff like this, and you can do that easily at thisisvillagechurch.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next week for Misquoted.